Have you ever felt that in a world filled with endless noise, the most important stories are the ones whispered in silence? What happens when a man who has everything is confronted by a girl who has nothing but a single profound desire? Today's story is about two worlds colliding, a tower of glass and a public library, a man who had forgotten his own story, and a girl who lived in thousands of them. If you believe that a single book can change a life or even rewrite a soul, then join our community. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and let's explore together how the smallest request can unlock the most profound transformations. From the 64th floor of the Thorne Tower, Julian Thorne watched the city breathe. He didn't see the millions of lives unfolding below, the intricate dance of joy and sorrow. He saw a system, a complex machine of assets and liabilities, of supply and demand. The city was a chessboard, and from his minimalist chrome and glass office, he was the master player, moving pieces with cold, efficient precision. His life was a reflection of his workspace, a series of calculated transactions, meetings scheduled in 7-minute increments, and human interactions stripped of all unnecessary warmth. His penthouse apartment was a testament to this philosophy, a vast, sterile space of white marble and black leather, where art was chosen for its investment value, and the silence was as curated as the view. He was a ghost in his own life, a man who had perfected the art of existing without truly living. He ate meals designed for optimal nutrition, not for pleasure. He wore suits tailored to project power, not for comfort. The people in his life were contacts, connections, resources to be managed. There were no friends, only allies. No love, only strategic partnerships. He had inherited an empire and had doubled its value, earning the world's admiration and his own quiet contempt. He was the architect of a gilded cage, a man so surrounded by wealth that he had forgotten what it felt like to want for anything, and in doing so had lost the ability to feel anything at all. Miles below the Thorne Tower, in the quiet, dusty aisles of the city's oldest public library, Elara lived in a different kind of kingdom. It was a kingdom built not of steel and glass, but of paper and ink, of fading covers and the silent collective hum of 1,000 imagined worlds. To the outside world, she was nearly invisible, a girl with worn-out shoes and a coat too thin for the coming winter, who moved through the city with a quiet, observant grace. She had almost nothing to her name, but within the hallowed walls of the library, she was wealthier than a queen. The silence here was not empty. It was filled with the voices of poets, the clash of swords, the whispers of lovers, and the roar of dragons. The library was her sanctuary and her ship, allowing her to sail to distant lands and forgotten eras. She didn't just read the books, she inhabited them. The characters were her companions, their struggles and triumphs her own. She was the keeper of their stories, treating each book with a reverence that bordered on devotion. She would trace the letters on a page as if they were sacred texts, her expression one of profound connection. She was a silent observer of the city, watching the hurried, stressed faces of the people outside and wondering if they knew about the magic that was available to them, free of charge, in this quiet, unassuming building. In a world that rushed past her, Elara had found her anchor in the timeless, unchanging power of a well-told story. Their two worlds, spinning in the same city but on entirely different axes, were destined to collide in the one place that represented a bridge between them, a luxury bookstore downtown. It was a place of polished wood floors, the rich smell of new paper, and hushed, reverent tones. Julian was there out of a sense of cold corporate duty. He needed a meaningless but expensive gift for a business associate, a leather-bound classic that would look good on a shelf but would likely never be opened. He moved through the store with an air of impatient disdain, the place a pointless obstacle in his ruthlessly efficient schedule. Elara was there for the opposite reason. She could never afford to buy anything in this store. She came simply to be near the new books, to run her fingers lightly over their crisp covers, to breathe in the intoxicating scent of fresh ink. It was a pilgrimage, a way to be close to the source of the magic she cherished. She stood in a quiet corner, lost in a display of fairy tales, when Julian's sharp, commanding presence cut through her reverie. He was speaking to a clerk, his voice low but impatient. Their eyes met for a fleeting second. He saw a nobody, a piece of the scenery. She saw a man who looked like one of the sad, lonely kings from her stories, a man who had a kingdom but had lost his soul. And in that moment, an idea born of desperation and a pure, unshakable belief in the power of stories took root in her heart. For Elara, the world seemed to slow down. The quiet murmur of the bookstore, the rustle of turning pages, the distant city sounds, it all faded into a dull hum. There was only the tall, imposing figure of Julian Thorne, a man who moved through the world as if he owned it, and the frantic, determined beating of her own heart. She had seen men like him before, from a distance, men in dark, expensive suits, with faces that seemed carved from stone. They were a different species, inhabitants of a world so far removed from her own that they might as well have been from another planet. But this one was here, now, just a few feet away. Fear, cold and sharp, told her to stay hidden, to remain invisible as she always had. But a different voice, a voice nurtured by the heroines in her books, whispered a different command: be brave. With a deep breath that did little to calm her trembling hands, she stepped out from behind the bookshelf. She moved with a quiet purpose, her worn-out shoes making no sound on the polished wood floor. She stood before him, a small, fragile figure in the shadow of his wealth and power. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice soft but clear, cutting through his impatient conversation with the clerk. Julian turned, his brow furrowed in annoyance at the interruption. His gaze swept over her, a quick, dismissive appraisal that took in her thin coat and simple dress. It was the look of a man for whom the world was divided into two categories, those who were useful and those who were in his way. She was clearly in the latter. But Elara did not flinch. She held his cold gray eyes with a courage she did not know she possessed. She didn't ask for money. She didn't offer a story of hardship. She simply pointed a slightly trembling finger toward a book on a nearby display table. It was a thick, beautifully illustrated volume, its cover depicting a dark, enchanted forest. It was a collection of old, half-forgotten fairy tales. "That book," she said, her voice gaining a quiet strength. Could you buy it for me?" Julian's expression shifted from annoyance to a kind of weary disbelief. A beggar, he thought, but a strangely specific one. He was about to utter a cold, curt refusal, to summon security, to erase this inconvenient blip from his afternoon. But Elara spoke again, and her words stopped him. "It's not just a book," she explained, her gaze shifting to the volume with a look of profound longing. "It's a window. My mother used to say that stories are windows, that if you look through them long enough, you can see a world where anything is possible, a world with a little bit of magic in it." She wasn't performing. There was no artifice in her voice, no calculated plea for sympathy. It was the raw, unvarnished truth, offered with a startling vulnerability. She spoke of how the tales in that specific collection were different, older, wilder, filled with a kind of dark magic that felt more real than the gray concrete world outside. She spoke not as a beggar asking for a handout, but as a believer trying to explain her faith to a skeptic. Her request was so pure, so utterly devoid of the cynicism and transactional nature that defined Julian's entire existence, that it momentarily bypassed all his defenses. He was a man who understood leverage, who could read the hidden motives in any negotiation. But here, there were no motives to read. There was only a girl who wanted a window, a girl who believed in magic. For a long, silent moment, Julian was adrift. Her genuine, almost childlike plea had struck a chord so deep within him that it had long been silent, a note he no longer recognized. It was a dissonant sound in the perfectly orchestrated symphony of his life, and he hated it. The feeling was uncomfortable, unfamiliar, inefficient. He wanted it to stop. He wanted to return to the predictable, logical world he understood, and so he did what he always did. He reduced the moment to a simple transaction. It was the fastest way to solve the problem, to make this strange, unsettling girl and her talk of magic disappear. "Fine," he said, his voice flat and cold. He signaled to the clerk, who had been watching the exchange with wide-eyed curiosity, "Add it to my bill." He did not look at Elara. He pulled out a sleek black credit card, the quiet tap of the plastic on the counter the only sound he was comfortable with. The clerk, flustered, quickly completed the sale. Julian took the heavy book, now in a glossy bag, and handed it to Elara. He was careful not to let their fingers touch. He offered no kind words, no smile. He simply completed the exchange, a transfer of goods for a moment of peace. "Here," he said, his eyes already focused on the exit. He turned and walked away without a backward glance, the sharp click of his shoes on the floor a sound of finality. He was relieved to have the encounter over with, eager to scrub the strange, inconvenient interaction from his memory. But as he stepped out into the cold city air, he found, to his profound irritation, that he couldn't. The image of the girl, the title of the book, and the ridiculous, haunting word, magic, followed him out the door. Julian Thorne was a master of compartmentalization. His mind was a fortress, its walls built high to keep emotion and inefficiency out. But the encounter in the bookstore was like a crack in that wall, a small, insignificant fissure through which a strange and unwanted light was beginning to seep. He returned to his office, the sterile sanctuary on the 64th floor, expecting the familiar, cold comfort of numbers and projections to wash away the lingering unease, but it did not. He sat before his 3 glowing monitors, the lifeblood of his empire, and saw not the rise and fall of stock prices, but the dark, enchanted forest on the cover of a book he had held for only a few seconds. The title, The Whispering Woods and Other Forgotten Tales, echoed in the silent, air-conditioned space. It was a ridiculous, childish title, and yet it refused to leave him. The unease grew into a low, thrumming irritation. He tried to bury himself in work, to force the memory out through sheer force of will. But the ghost of the book was persistent. He saw the title reflected in the glass of his office window. He overheard 2 assistants in the hallway discussing a weekend trip to a cabin in the woods. He saw an advertisement on a passing bus for a fantasy movie, its font eerily similar to the one on the book's cover. The world, which had always been a predictable, logical system, was suddenly conspiring against him, filling itself with reminders of a moment he desperately wanted to forget. It was as if the story had escaped the pages of the book and was now beginning to haunt the sterile corridors of his own life. That night, sleep offered no escape. He was plagued by fragmented dreams, not of corporate takeovers or market crashes, but of something softer, warmer, from a time he had long ago locked away. And then a single clear memory broke through the surface of his consciousness with the force of a tidal wave. He was not in his cold, minimalist penthouse. He was a small boy, curled up in a large, worn armchair, the scent of pipe tobacco and old paper in the air. His father was sitting beside him, his voice a low, gentle rumble as he read aloud. The book in his father's hands was not the same one from the bookstore, but it was a cousin to it, a heavy, illustrated volume of classic fables. It was a memory of a time before the empire, before the duty, before the cold, hard shell had formed around his heart. His father had been a different kind of man, a dreamer, a storyteller, a lover of literature who had been thrust into the world of business by his own father. He had dreamed of being a writer, a poet. But a sudden illness, a tragic and swift decline, had forced a promise from a teenage Julian to abandon his own budding love for stories, to take up the mantle of the family business, to be the ruthless, pragmatic man his father could never be. And Julian, out of a sense of grief-stricken duty, had kept that promise. He had buried his own dreams, his own story, along with his father. The book Elara had asked for was not just a book, it was a key to a locked room in his soul, a room that held the ghost of the boy he used to be and the man he was never allowed to become. The realization did not bring peace. It brought a storm. The carefully constructed order of his life, his entire identity, was built upon the foundation of that one solemn promise. To question it was to risk the collapse of everything he was. The irritation he felt toward the girl in the bookstore now morphed into a strange obsessive need. It was an irrational, illogical impulse, the kind he had spent his entire adult life eradicating. He didn't understand it, but he was consumed by it. He needed to find her, not to offer her charity, not to assuage some newfound guilt. He needed to find her because she was, somehow, connected to the key that had unlocked that painful, forgotten room. He did what he did best. He deployed his resources. The CEO, who could track global market trends with frightening accuracy, now tasked his highly paid team of analysts with a new, bizarre mission: find a poor, nameless girl who was seen in a luxury bookstore. He gave them a vague description, the title of the book, the time of the encounter. It was an impossible, absurd task. His team was bewildered, but they did as they were told. Julian Thorne, the architect of a financial empire, was now using its vast, powerful machinery not to close a multi-million-dollar deal, but to search the sprawling, anonymous city for a single, quiet girl. He was a man possessed, driven by a desperate, unspoken hope that in finding her, he might also find a way to navigate the wreckage of his own forgotten story. Julian's vast resources, for once, did not fail him. After 2 days of methodical, if confused searching, his team found her. Not through credit card trails or surveillance cameras, but through a simple human connection. One of his analysts had a cousin who volunteered at the city's main public library, and the description of a quiet, book-loving girl with a thin coat was instantly recognizable. The library. The irony was not lost on Julian. He, who lived in a sterile tower that touched the sky, would have to descend to the one place he had avoided his entire adult life, a place of silence, of shared resources, of a wealth that could not be quantified. He stood before the library's grand stone entrance, feeling more out of place than he had in any foreign boardroom. His tailored suit felt like a costume, his confidence a hollow facade. He found her in a quiet, sunlit corner of the reading room, the very book he had bought for her open in her lap. She was so absorbed in the story that she did not notice him approach. He stood there for a long moment, watching her. A man accustomed to commanding attention, now feeling like an intruder. "Elara," he said, the name feeling strange on his tongue. She looked up, her eyes wide, not with fear, but with a quiet, startled surprise. In this space, the power dynamic was completely inverted. He was the one who was lost, awkward, his usual arsenal of authority rendered useless. She was in her sanctuary, surrounded by the silent, steadfast companionship of a million stories. She was the one who was home. He had rehearsed what he would say, a series of logical, efficient statements to explain his presence. But looking at her now, surrounded by the gentle, dusty light of the library, the words felt crass and inadequate. He had no offer her money or a job. He didn't know what to offer. So he simply gestured to the book. "That story," he said, his voice lower than he intended. "The one about the king who loses his shadow. I remember my father reading it to me." It was a clumsy, unplanned confession, but it was the most honest thing he had said to another human being in years. A spark of understanding lit up Elara's eyes. She did not question his sudden appearance. She simply patted the empty space on the bench beside her. And so began their unlikely ritual. A few times a week, Julian Thorne would leave his glass tower and descend into the quiet, sacred space of the public library. They would sit together, not as a CEO and a poor girl, but as two readers. At first, he just listened. He listened as Elara spoke about the stories in the book, her voice filled with a passion and insight that was breathtaking. She didn't just analyze the plots, she felt the characters' heartbeats. She saw the metaphors in the enchanted forests, the lessons in the talking animals, the truths in the magic. She was teaching him how to read again, not just the words on the page, but the layers of meaning, the echoes of human experience that lay beneath. Through her eyes, the cynical, calculating man who saw the world in black and white began once more to see in color. The bridge of words they built between them grew stronger with each meeting. The stories in the book became a safe, neutral ground where they could explore ideas of loss, of duty, of courage, and of regret without having to speak directly of their own lives. But one afternoon, while discussing a tale about a prince forced to wear an iron mask to hide his identity, the metaphor became too powerful to ignore. Elara looked at him with her clear, perceptive gaze and asked a simple, devastating question. "What story are you hiding, Julian?" The question, so direct and yet so gentle, shattered the last of his defenses. And in the quiet, dusty silence of the library, surrounded by the ghosts of a million other storytellers, Julian Thorne finally told his own. He spoke of the boy he had been, a boy who lived more in the pages of books than in the real world, a boy who dreamed of writing his own epics. He spoke of his father, of their shared love for literature, a bond forged in the quiet ritual of reading aloud. And he spoke of the crushing weight of his father's death and the promise he had made at his graveside, a solemn vow to put away childish dreams, to become the man the company needed, to lock his own story in a box and throw away the key. As he spoke, the weight of 20 years of unspoken grief, of a life lived as a performance, began to lift. He was not confessing to a stranger. He was confessing to the only person in the world who would understand that abandoning a story is a fate worse than death. Just as Julian began to feel the first tentative stirrings of his old self, the world he had built came to reclaim him. A crisis erupted within his empire, a hostile takeover bid from a ruthless competitor that threatened to dismantle everything his father and grandfather had built. The situation demanded a swift, brutal response. His board of directors, his lawyers, his entire team looked to him, the cold, calculating strategist they had always known, to do what was necessary. The plan they presented was brutally efficient, a scorched earth defense that would involve gutting a smaller subsidiary company, laying off hundreds of employees, and destroying a community in a small, distant town, all to protect the larger corporate body. It was a move the old Julian would have made without a moment's hesitation. It was logical, pragmatic, and profitable. The numbers on the spreadsheet told a clear and simple story of survival. For a chilling moment, he felt the familiar, cold armor settling back over him. The pull of his old identity, the weight of his promise to his father to be a pragmatist, was immense. He was being called back to the throne of his lonely kingdom, and the part of him that had ruled for 20 years was ready to answer. The whispers of the boardroom, filled with talk of market share and shareholder value, threatened to drown out the softer, quieter voice he had only just begun to hear again. That evening, he left the sterile, high-pressure environment of the tower and on pure instinct found himself walking toward the public library. It was late and the library was closed, its windows dark. But he stood outside under the soft glow of a street lamp, the silence of the place a stark contrast to the storm raging in his mind. He didn't need to go inside. The lessons Elara had taught him were now a part of him. He closed his eyes and remembered a specific story from the book, a fable they had discussed just a week prior. It was the tale of the Gilded King, a monarch so obsessed with the wealth of his kingdom that he commanded his alchemists to find a way to turn everything he touched into gold. He succeeded, and at first he was ecstatic. His palace gleamed, his gardens were filled with golden flowers. But then he tried to eat, and his food turned to metal in his mouth. He tried to drink, and his water became an indigestible lump. In his moment of triumph, he was starving. The final devastating blow came when he reached out to hug his young daughter, and she too turned into a cold, lifeless golden statue. The king, surrounded by unimaginable riches, had lost everything that truly mattered. He had gained a kingdom of gold, but had lost his entire world. The moral of the story, as Elara had explained it, was not about greed, but about value. It was a warning that the things we can count are rarely the things that count the most. Julian returned to the Thorne Tower the next morning. A different man walked into the boardroom. The air was thick with expectation, his team ready for the order to attack. He stood at the head of the long, polished table, looked at the faces of the people who had served his cold ambition for years, and he saw not allies, but fellow prisoners of a gilded cage. He took the detailed, ruthless plan they had prepared and, in a single, decisive gesture, tore it in half. A collective gasp filled the room. "We're not doing this," he announced, his voice quiet but imbued with a new, unshakable authority. He did not yell, he did not posture, he simply explained. He spoke not of profit and loss, but of people and community. He presented an alternative, a plan that was riskier, more complex, and less immediately profitable. It involved innovation, collaboration, and a short-term financial hit, but it would save the subsidiary company and the jobs of its employees. It was a plan built not on the brutal logic of numbers, but on the quiet wisdom of a fairy tale. His board was stunned, his advisors horrified. They argued, they protested, they warned him of the consequences. But Julian was resolute. For the first time, he was not just defending his father's legacy, he was honoring his father's lost dream. It was his first official act not as a CEO, but as himself. And as he walked out of the stunned silence of the boardroom, he felt a profound sense of lightness, the feeling of a man who had finally, after 20 long years, put down a weight he never knew he was carrying. The fallout from Julian's decision was immediate and seismic. The business world was baffled, Wall Street was scandalized, and his company's stock took a temporary shop dive. Pundits called him a fool, a reckless idealist who had lost his edge. But in a small, forgotten town hundreds of miles away, hundreds of families kept their homes, their community, their hope. And slowly, unexpectedly, Julian's radical act of corporate empathy began to change the narrative. His company, once seen as a cold, predatory giant, was now lauded for its integrity. Talented, innovative people, the kind who valued purpose over profit, flocked to work for him. In losing millions, Julian had gained something far more valuable, a soul. He knew he had to honor the source of this transformation. His first major act as the new man was not a business acquisition, but a quiet, deeply personal gift. He established the Thorne Literacy Foundation, a charitable organization dedicated to funding public libraries and promoting reading programs in underprivileged communities across the city. It was named not after himself, but in memory of his father, the man who had first taught him the magic of a story. The foundation's first and largest grant was given to the old, struggling public library where he had met Elara. It was a gift that would ensure its doors would remain open for generations to come, a silent thank you to the place and the person who had given him back his own story. The final scene of Julian's transformation is not set in the gleaming, sterile throne room of his corporate empire. We see him in a different space entirely. It is a smaller room filled with the warm, rich tones of wood and the soft glow of a desk lamp. It is his father's old study, a room in the family home that he had kept locked for 20 years. The walls are lined not with financial charts, but with books, real books with cracked spines and dog-eared pages. He is sitting at a heavy, dark wood desk, the kind that feels solid and permanent. In front of him, there is no contract, no financial report. There is only a single elegant fountain pen, his father's pen, and a crisp, clean, blank page. He is no longer wearing the restrictive armor of a suit. He is in a simple sweater, his posture relaxed, his face calm. He looks out the window for a moment at the leaves of an old oak tree. Then he looks back at the page. A small, genuine smile touches his lips. He picks up the pen, the weight of it familiar and right in his hand. And then he begins to write. We do not see the words he writes, but we know. After a lifetime of executing other people's plans and fulfilling a promise made in grief, Julian Thorne is finally, at long last, beginning to write his own story. The story ends not with a single image, but with two, a final, quiet diptych that speaks of a legacy reborn. In one frame, we see Elara. She is sitting on a bench in the newly renovated children's wing of the public library, a space made possible by Julian's foundation. She is reading aloud to a small, enraptured group of children, her voice filled with the same quiet passion she once shared with a lonely billionaire. The light streaming through the large new windows catches the silver of a small scholarship medal pinned to her coat. Her request for a single book has blossomed into a forest of stories for countless others. In the other frame, we see Julian writing at his father's desk. The late afternoon sun illuminates his face, a face no longer etched with the cold lines of command, but with the quiet concentration of a creator. He is no longer the architect of emptiness. He is the author of a new life. The two images, separate but deeply connected, form a final silent poem. A single whispered request for a book had not just changed a life or even two. It had rewritten their destinies, creating a legacy not of wealth or power, but of words, of connection, and of the quiet, enduring magic that can only be found in a story that is finally, truly one's own.